The road to annihilation was marked by events that specifically affected men as men and women as women. Both sexes were subjected to similar forms of persecution and violence. Abuse, forced labor, starvation, deportation, humiliation, and death, but only women had to cope with pregnancy, abortions, and invasive gynecological examinations. Even though some Jewish men experienced various forms of sexual violence, the majority of rape victims and survivors are women. Despite the growing interest in women's experiences in the Holocaust, the issue of sexual violence remains one of the under-researched topics. The wartime Ukraine could serve as a focus and lens through which questions of sexual victimization and sexual agency of Jewish women during the show could be studied. The sexual assault occurred in different locations, including Jewish homes, streets, prisons, killing sites, and hiding places. In hundreds of ghettos and camps, concentration camps, forced labor camps, in occupied Ukraine during the Second World War, Jewish women were particularly vulnerable to various patterns of sexual humiliation and abuse. During those routine procedures in camps and ghettos, women suffered not only from men's unpleasant scrutiny, but also from the fact that men were touching their breasts and genitalia. Some bodily searches for valuables were overt acts of sexual violence. There were also cases of sexualized violence perpetrated to punish women for certain wrongdoings and intimidate others. Edmund Bonvold, the Holocaust survivor of the Januska camp in Lviv, recalled that a member of camp leadership forced Jewish newcomers to strip to take their possessions. One of the young women refused to do so. For disobedience, he forced her to lift her skirt from behind and then shot her in the genitals. He called up a Jewish man and ordered him to cart her around the square until she died. In some camps and ghettos, women went through forced abortions, sterilizations, and medical experiments. Bella Habis, the Holocaust survivor from the Bershad camp in Vinnytsia Oblast, remembered that women in the camp had formaldehyde solution injected in utero, which caused strong pain and bleeding. Such violence constituted an attack against women's reproductive bodies biologically designed to reproduce the Jewish nation. It can thus be considered genocidal sexual violence. During the war in former Yugoslavia, 1992 to 1995, up to 6,000 women were raped. However, statistical data on the exact number of victims is variable, and the UN report revealed that the crimes of the most deprived nature were committed during that war. Women were raped and gang-raped in front of family or local community members, and they were kept at special detention camps like Omarska, Karatom, and Tunapolj camps where they were routinely raped. They were also victims of forcible impregnation as a part of ethnic cleansing, because in those societies the origin of the child is determined through fatherhood. The Second World War brought atrocities and an enormous amount of suffering to civilians of all ages, ethnicity, and gender. Similarly to any previous armed conflict, most of the civilian victims were women. Although some research has been conducted on the scale of crimes committed against women during World War I, the international community still lacks precise and reliable data on exact cases. General evidence of the magnitude of violence against women during World War II has been fully expressed by the Commission of Government Experts for the Study of the Convention for the Protection of War Victims. Part of that report is undoubtedly worth citing. When innumerable women of all ages, and even children, were subjected to outrages of the worst kind, rape committed in occupied territories, brutal treatment of every sort, mutilations, etc. in areas where troops were stationed or through which they passed. Thousands of women were made to enter brothels against their will or were contaminated with venereal diseases, the incidence of which often increased on an alarming scale. Women were also victims of sexual violence and medical experiments of the worst kind in Nazi concentration camps. One of the most shocking examples of massive and state-organized programs for the sexual exploitation of women during wartime was the case of the so-called comfort women. That euphemism hides the Japanese army system, which turned hundreds of thousands of women, mostly Koreans, into sex slaves. They were captured and kept in camps called comfort stations, in fact acting as brothels. where they were repeatedly raped and subjected to other forms of sexual exploitation and violence. Many of them did not survive the war, and those who did suffer permanent and deep physical and mental injuries. After years of denial, under the huge pressure of NGOs, finally in 2015, Japanese government apologized and recognized Japan's responsibility and committed itself to paying $8.03 to fund victims, 46 of which are still alive. In ghettos and concentration camps, German authorities deployed women in forced labor under conditions that often led to their deaths. German physicians and medical researchers use Jewish and Roma view this term in the glossary. Gypsy women as subjects for sterilization view this term in the glossary. Experiments and other unethical human experimentation. In both camps and ghettos, women were particularly vulnerable to beatings and rape. Pregnant Jewish women often tried to conceal their pregnancies or were forced to submit to abortions. Females deported from Poland and the Soviet Union for forced labor in the Reich were often beaten or raped or forced to submit to sexual relations for food or other necessities or basic comforts. Pregnancy sometimes resulted in Polish, Soviet, or Yugoslav forced laborers from sexual relations with German men. If so-called race experts determined that the child was not capable of Germanization, the women were generally forced to have abortions, sent to give birth in makeshift nurseries where conditions would guarantee the death of the infants, or simply shipped to the region they came from without food or medical care. The Germans established brothels in some concentration and labor camps, and the German army ran roughly 500 brothels for soldiers, in which women were forced to work. Many women incarcerated in the concentration camps created informal mutual assistance groups that facilitated survival through sharing information, food, and clothing. Often, the members of such groups came from the same city or province, and had a similar level and style of education or shared family ties. Other women were able to survive when the SS camp authorities deployed them in clothing repair, cooking, laundry, and house cleaning detachments. Women have always worked outside the home, but never before in the numbers or with the same impact as they did in World War II. Before the war, most of the women that did work were from the lower working classes, and many of these were minorities. There were a variety of attitudes towards women in the workforce. Some thought they should only have jobs that men didn't want, while others felt women should give up their jobs so unemployed men could have a job, especially during the Great Depression. Still, others held the view that women from the middle class or above should never lower themselves to go to work. These and other viewpoints would be challenged by the United States' entry into World War II. With men off to fight a worldwide war across the Atlantic and the Pacific, women were called to take their place on the production line. The War Manpower Commission, a federal agency established to increase the manufacture of war materials, had the task of recruiting women into employment vital to the war effort. Men's attitude towards women in the workforce was one challenge to overcome, but, surprisingly, women's ideas about work outside the home had to change as well. Two of the primary sources below deal with arguments to challenge these attitudes. Several cities across the nation had a positive economic effect because of the demand for manufactured war materials. In Alabama, no city felt a greater impact than Mobile. Estimated 90,000 workers swarmed into the city to work in the local war factories, especially in one of the two shipyards, Gulf Shipbuilding and Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding, or in the ALCOA factory. The ALCOA plant alone would produce 34% of the nation's aluminum, a metal necessary for the production of airplanes. Men still worked at these plants, but without the women, these plants would have never been as productive or as successful as they ultimately were. After the war, most women returned home, let go from their jobs. Their jobs, again, belonged to men. However, there were lasting effects. Women had proven that they could do the job, and within a few decades, women in the workforce became a common sight. An immediate effect is often overlooked. These women had saved much of their wages since there was little to buy during the war. It was this money that helped serve as a down payment for a new home and helped launch the prosperity of the 1950s. During both world wars, women were required to undertake new roles in their respective national war efforts. Women across the world experienced severe setbacks as well as considerable societal progress during this time frame. The two world wars hinged as much on industrial production as they did on battlefield clashes. The cessation was needed with millions of men away fighting, and with the inevitable casualties, there was a severe shortage of labor in a range of industries. From rural and farm work to urban office jobs, cessation needed. While some women managed to enter the traditionally male career paths, women, for the most part, were expected to be primarily involved in duties at home and women's work, especially after the wars were over. On the other hand, the two wars also victimized women and subjected them to numerous incidences of sexual violence, abuse, and death.